passages from Of Mice and Men, and the first is some dialogue. In this speech, the farmhand Crooks rejects Lemmy's notion that he and George will one day buy a piece of land and live off of it. So, would you be willing to read that one?
Me?
You're gonna be so good at this.
Alright, okay. I see hundreds of men come by on the road and on the ranches, with their biddles on their back and that same damn thing in their hands. Hundreds of them. They come and they quit and go on, and every damn one of them got a little piece of land in his hand. And never a goddamn one of them ever gets it. Just like heaven. Everybody wants a little piece of land. I read plenty of books out here. Nobody never gets to heaven, and nobody gets to land. It's just in their head. They're all the time talking about it, but it's just in their head.
Good. So when I read through this, the first thing that I notice is there are lots of contractions. So this is dialogue. He's kind of talking with the dialect of the time period. So we've got like and with an apostrophe instead of and. We've
What's that
got
called?
contraction. So it's like you're taking out like a letter or parts of a word and then you put in an apostrophe to take the place, and it just kind of demonstrates like dialect or maybe some accent, just so that as you're reading, it kind of feels like somebody from that time period and that place that's talking like they would in that time. So contractions are one thing that I noticed. Another thing that I noticed is the slang. So you'll notice that bindles is one of the slang words that we talked about. That's kind of from the time period as well. So those are things that I noticed as I'm reading through this. And then we're going to compare it to the setting passage on the first page, which is just John Steinbeck, like setting the stage. And you'll notice that the tone and the language used is very different. So would someone be willing to read the second passage?
I can.
You can do this.
A few miles south of Soledad, the Salinas River drops in close to the hillside bank and runs deep and deep. The water is warm to refer to has slick twinkling over the yellow sands in the sunlight before reaching the narrow pool. On one side of the river, the golden foothill slopes curve up to the strong rocky gravelland mountains. But on the valley side, the water is lined with trees, willows fresh and green with every spring, carrying in their lower leaf junctures the debris of the winter's flooding, and sycamores with mottled white recumbent limbs and branches that arch over the pool.
So when I read this, the things that stand out to me are the formality of the text. First of all, I feel like Steinbeck, when he's writing this, just from like the narration perspective instead of from the dialogue perspective, the formality is elevated. There aren't any contractions. He's using bigger words than the characters would if they were talking, right? So he's talking about the leaf junctures and the debris. He's also using more complicated syntax. So we've got the sentence, it looks like the last sentence is a very complex sentence. It's got, there's like semicolon, we've got lots of commas, we've got a dash. So it's definitely an elevated tone and elevated style, which you can tell from the diction and syntax. So those are two things that I would compare and contrast as I was reading. Those are things that I would note. So I want you to just take a minute, read through this, and then read through the rest of the passages from the other texts that we go back to the first passages that we read from Of Mice and Men. So why do you think that John Steinbeck made the choices that he did in terms of language? We looked at the dialogue, and we looked at like the narration, and the language is different. The language is different. Why do you think that John Steinbeck made those language choices?
Okay, great. Okay. I think like to add like insight like on the characters like through his dialogue and speech, like kind of like by using like more formal speech, kind of to like show off his writing style and like explaining that through the setting. And I think like with like the dialogue, just to kind of like get a feel of like who the character is in a sense.
Okay, so the just kind of helps to characterize Christ. Any thoughts? Yeah, I think that's great. I definitely think that you're right, that we definitely have two different language styles. And I think that when we listen, or well, not when we listen to, when we read the dialogue, it kind of takes us like almost into the time period and we're like talking to these characters and it does help to characterize them.
Also makes them seem like more people. Like I feel like one person would be like a few miles south of the sun.
That's true, so they seem more like people.
You can also reflect on how wealthy they are, because usually like, you can tell like financially that they're different based on the way they talk. Not always, but generally, like I feel like
There's always those guys that live in like $2 million houses that act all the
true. I mean, but that's not like I think the general appearance of when people are like are really well off, like the way wear suits and top off fancy or whatever.
Okay, so it kind of demonstrates their social class.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially in like the 1930s, they wouldn't have been talking like this if they were like in a good, wealthy place. And also, I said that it like kind of shows the slang for workers in the 1930s, like how you would usually, or like how you use like grammar when writing a story.
Good, I like that. Any other thoughts? She's there was a panic moment though.
You should have read
Okay, so the next one is Central Part 5. The question is, in what ways might environment, culture, and history impact the language? So syntax, diction, formality, etc. What did you guys think about that passage? Yeah.
I said Sarah Burns uses very formal language in Central Park 5 due to the seriousness of the violence and crime that she's talking about. And that she wants to come off very serious and make it clear that what she's talking about is important to her and it's not a joke.
Good, I like that. So there's definitely like a formality to the language that she chooses, and I think it matches the seriousness of what was going on.
Like for like the history part, like because there was like more crime in this time period, like just like her wording was more like factual and like like it's just your handwriting and like law related, so like it's more like evidence based. And then for culture, like there's like a big culture of fear that's like kind of like represented throughout this like text. And just like the examples were like women like having like being advised to like stay in groups on subways to like not get like sexually assaulted. As well as like pickpocketing, like like being a concern on subways and like car break-ins and drugs, like kind of running the city at that time period.
Good, I like that. I like that you talked about how she uses a lot of law terminology, which I think like it kind of gives her credibility, right? So she's trying to use language that shows that she's an authority and that she's using like statements of fact, right? Which I like that. Any other thoughts? Okay, so then let's jump to Death of the Salesman. So in what ways might history, culture, and environment impact the language in Death of the Salesman?
So within the history part, it shows how like Willie is more like hopeful and like, has all these like dreams for like what his life can be, what his son's like lives will look like, and it's not always like based in reality. And while Biff is more like hopeless and like pessimistic about it, he's like, well, I'm not really making much money, $1 an hour only. And then Linda is more like sympathetic and compassionate and like doesn't like is trying not to like make people too upset. And also shows about like the hardships in the time period with the lack of jobs and resources and like more, and it goes into the environment, like starting to get by and like make money. And then like about the culture, it's that it's very like work oriented and money is like the goal. And with like what they're focusing on, like most of the movie, like we talk about money and like what job Bigfoot is or isn't having and like how successful he is.
Good. I like that you kind of talked about how, like, it's kind of through their talking and through their dialogue that they show, like, the history and the culture and the environment. And, like, I think it's interesting that, kind of like you said, Linda is very compassionate. And I feel like that's kind of a gender stereotype of the time period in this traditional family, which is kind of the environment and the culture, right? And you can see that through the dialogue. So, any other thoughts? Okay, awesome. So then overall, what is the relationship among history, culture, and environment? And what impact do these elements have on authors' language choices, just in general?
Me? Oh, great. Okay. So I said like being able to like piece together a story plot with like the word choice, and like informative, like information as well as like added meaning. Information, not informative. That made no sense. Okay, moving on.
You're good.
And then, like the way, you're gonna have to read this. I cannot read. What does that say?
When the author shows that characters talk reflects a time period and what the audience like is like what the work is targeting for the audience and what they want the audience to know based on what the writing is.
That does not say that, but okay.
Any other thoughts? Okay, cool. Then we are done with the